This is For Keeps, a podcast about collections and connections. I'm David Peterkowski. This collector's story centers on one man's exhaustive efforts to commemorate a historical bit of airborne elegance. His collection captures a moment in time, actually a little over a quarter century in length, when form met function, speed met style, two rival nations made for unlikely engineering bedfellows, and well-heeled travelers got from point A to point B in record time.
What was once a leisurely, some would say boring flight is now almost a hurried one. Minutes after the quail in brandy sauce with truffles, we were over the eastern seaboard.
That ABC News report from 1976 covered the first day of commercial service for the Concorde, the supersonic airliner that captured the fancy of the general public and captured fancy passengers with deep pockets along the way. Flown primarily between London and New York by British Airways and Paris and New York by Air France, the Concorde was a joint venture between the governments of France and Great Britain, and the unorthodox partnership created a plane that could fly more than twice the speed of sound, cutting transatlantic travel time roughly in half for those who could afford it. Equally impressive were the design touches, both inside the plane and out, that put the Concorde in a class of its own. Engineered for supersonic flight that took it roughly 11 miles above the Earth, the aircraft boasted triangular wings that wouldn't look out of place on a military plane, a narrow fuselage just 10 feet wide to reduce drag, and a nose that could be lowered, a so-called droop snoot, to enable the pilots to see more clearly while taking off at a steeper than usual angle. Inside, the Concorde's design touches reflected its status as a status symbol when it came to elite travel experiences. Passengers were typically greeted by name, ate gourmet meals from menus designed by chefs who cooked for the British royal family or had earned Michelin stars, and enjoyed champagne chilled in sterling silver ice buckets. Sadly, the high-flying years of the Concorde didn't last forever. An Air France Concorde crashed in 2000. Killing 109 people on board, as well as 4 others on the ground. Not long after, the significant expense of operating the planes and the travel downturn following the September 11th terrorist attacks led British Airways and Air France to deem the Concorde unsustainable, retiring it in the fall of 2003. But the supersonic aircraft's legacy of luxury and innovation has inspired one man to collect as much Concorde memorabilia as he can, particularly as it relates to the much-lauded in-flight food service. His name is Nathan Shedroff, and he's a San Francisco-based consultant, author, and professor of design, strategy, innovation, and sustainability. With that kind of a background, it's pretty clear why Nathan is a serious Concorde enthusiast. And for the past 2 decades, he's built up an amazing collection of items that were either used on Concorde aircraft or were gift items that celebrated the planes. In all, Nathan's got more than a dozen complete Concorde place settings, everything from the plates to the silverware to the napkin rings. He's got champagne glasses, caviar spoons, salt and pepper shakers, coasters, bottle openers, and drink stirrers. And he's got brochures, in-flight magazines, and safety cards, plus gift items ranging from Concorde cufflinks to a Concorde wallet. Most of his items come from the British Airways side of Concorde history, and that's the airline that Nathan was lucky enough to travel on, via Concorde, from London to New York in 2003, just a few months before the Concorde was grounded for good. Nathan was born in the mid-1960s, at a time when the Concorde had been announced and was under development. While he can't recall when he first heard about the Concorde, his interest in it sprang from an early fascination with the futuristic, aviation included.
I've always been interested in aerospace. When I was in high school, I thought I might want to be an aerospace engineer, and I've always been oriented towards space and science fiction and NASA, et cetera. So It would have been when I was in probably high school sometime, but I wouldn't be able to tell you about the moment when I first learned of the Concorde. But it's always been an exciting plane to me, partly because of its capabilities and mostly because it's a consumer airplane. It's not a military airplane. It's not spacecraft. It's something that, ideally we all could have partaken in. Obviously, for financial reasons, not everyone was going to get on the Concorde.
Years later, he was able to fly on the Concorde, but it wasn't until after the plane's retirement that he began to seek out Concorde collectibles.
This started about maybe 16 years ago. And the first thing I ever collected was a luggage tag that I found on eBay. So that's the first thing I bought. It was from a man in Israel, as I remember. And I had a love for the Concorde before that. And it's because the Concorde, for me, is a symbol of wonder. It's a symbol of the potential of technology and human achievement. And I think that it has a lot of meaning for a lot of people over and above, let's say, the 787, which is a wonderful plane, but doesn't hold that kind of status and symbolism for people. So I've always been a fan of the Concorde, and that luggage tag was the first thing that I had a chance to acquire, to own a piece of it.
So you sought it out. You're like, I'm going to start collecting Concorde stuff.
Yeah, I was writing a book at the time about meaning and how to design meaning, and wonder is one of the 15 core meanings that we identified. And so in looking at examples to use in the book, when I got to wonder, I naturally asked the question, well, what triggers wonder for me? And the space program, NASA in general, and then the Concorde came to mind. Not that they're the only things, but they were prominent things. And for some reason, it never occurred to me that you could actually buy souvenirs and eventually parts and other things connected to these things. And so I decided to go looking, and that was something I could afford that I thought maybe I would even use in my daily life.
As his collecting began to take off, Nathan's fascination with the service angle of the Concorde experience led him to collect heavily in one specific area of the aircraft's history, its high-end in-flight food service.
Even in high school, I thought it was cool that, like, first class or business class, they had these place settings. And I had always thought, I've never been too much of a traditionalist. So like the idea of investing and buying a China pattern for my house and all that kind of stuff, that was never of interest or concern for me. But I thought, well, if I ever did something like that, it would probably be from an airline. And so thanks to eBay opening up this market for everyone, I went looking for plates and glasses and silverware, servingware, etc., from the Concorde at that point. And that kind of started a little eBay problem, we'll just say, for a few years, where I ended up collecting a lot of memorabilia.
So as your collection grew, where did you wind up storing things?
That's a good question. Like these packages would come in by UPS or FedEx or USPS. And I have to say some of them were dreadfully packaged. There was a gentleman in the UK that I was buying glasses from, and he packed them in not even cardboard boxes, really thin boxboard. And so they would come with half of them broken, which was just such a shame. And so as they would come in, I would, of course, unpack them and look at them. But then I would just sort of repack them into a big cardboard box or some of those plastic covered bins you can get at Costco or Home Depot, etc. And it wasn't until a few years later when I decided I need to have a big dinner party. And so I had a dinner party, and it was the first time I had unboxed all of it and put it together on the counter. And that's sort of when it hits you like, oh, I have quite a collection here.
So as you were acquiring these items, and it sounds like you got a lot of them through eBay, did you get a sense that there were a lot of Concorde collectors out there like you?
I don't think that there were a lot. I actually think that there are more now. And I think that the prices for certain items reflect that because prices have definitely gone up. So in some ways I was kind of early to Concorde collecting, and I had found out that I had missed by like 6 or 9 months the big Sotheby's auction of all of the Concorde stuff. And so I was buying from people that had an opportunity to buy big lots from the Concorde at the time. And so they were selling off the pieces, the bulk pieces that they bought. So I was kind of buying secondhand, but it was still fairly new. I should also probably say that I did get a chance to fly the Concorde in its last summer. Coming back, I specifically chose to fly from London to New York because you end up landing before you left, time zone wise. And so I did get that experience and have been on the plane for food service and etc. And that was a big booster to my collection. But I think I had already started to collect a little by then.
So did you pocket a salt shaker or two while you were on there?
No, sadly not. I have done that on United before and on a Virgin flight once. Nobody come after me. But no, I did not do that on a Concorde flight. And of course, friends later have just questioned why I hadn't. So no, I had to collect everything via eBay. Or there was one other source that I used, and that is it was impossible to find the little round butter pats. They're little short, teeny dishes that they would top off with butter to serve with food service. Could not find them anywhere. And I had made a trip to the BA, the British Airways Museum, which was at Heathrow, sort of on the backside of Heathrow before, and they gave me a little tour, and that was really wonderful. So I contacted them and said, hey, is there any way that you might be able to put your hands on or show me, where I might find these little butter pats? Because they were literally the last thing that I needed to complete the place settings. I had all the serviceware, I had the silverware, I had the authentic napkins and placemats, I had the salt and pepper shaker. Like, I literally had everything except for this little round butter pat. And they were very nice enough to suggest a place that I could get them. And I just bought the 13 or 14, and that completed my collection of the place setting. But everything else was eBay. And still to this day, every now and then I'll still find something on eBay, although it's much rarer. And then just 2 weeks ago, a good friend found that his dad had collected one of the Concorde wallets from back in the 80s. And, it was in a pile of stuff at his folks' house. And he suggested that his dad send it to me to find maybe a better home for it. And so they just sent it to me. And so in a couple cases, I get some pieces from other people or other avenues. But I think that's ever only been about 2 or 3 pieces.
Uh-huh. So I want to dive a little deeper into your collection. Off the top of your head, what would you say are the standout items, either in terms of rarity or quantity, since it sounds like you have no shortage of certain items?
Yeah, I have 13 place settings, plus a couple spares. Right off the bat, I was very interested in the customer experience. So the experience you have when you're on the plane. So the place settings, I didn't go after the headphones. If there were headphones, I don't know now. It was really more about food service. So I focused on that. And that's why I have sort of 13 plus settings so that I could have dinner parties. I could actually use it. It was never meant for me to keep as mint collection, but also the other kinds of things that you encounter, like the tickets and the wallets and they had gift items like blankets and pins and things like that. I will say there's this other item. There's a little, I would never need a caviar spoon, but there's these little mother of pearl caviar spoons that are just really beautiful because of the material. The shape isn't even, Concorde special, but they're just these sort of beautiful little moments. So that's another piece I really appreciate of all the sort of other little pieces. I made a conscious choice early on to focus on the last fit from BA specifically. Air France had some beautiful little items, but I didn't focus on all the place settings and the sort of detail there. It was all British Airways and literally the last fit. So the last design that they produced when the Concordes came back online after the disaster, because they were just beautifully designed. They weren't as traditional as all the items that were there before. So I do have some other pieces. I have some Air France pieces because they are absolutely stunning. After everything I just said about focusing on British Airways, my very favorite piece of my entire collection is from Air France, actually. It's a bottle opener made in the shape of the Concorde. So if you think about a typical metal bottle opener, but you flared the end of one of them and then you just gave it a little bend about a third of the way through, it actually becomes a representation of the Concorde. It was very ingenious. And it's also completely inexpensive and utilitarian. And so it represents this little wonderful sort of design exercise to take something so normal and make just two changes to it. And then it instantly elevates into this other category and references to this plane, etc. It's not the most elegant, careful, beautiful design of anything that was created, either on the Air France side or the BA side, but it was by far the most clever and in that sense, kind of the most wonderful.
Right down to the most mundane parts of the flying experience.
Right, exactly. And I know that there are people who collect the nose cone, which is gigantic, or parts of the plane itself. But that stuff never really interested me as much as what was happening on the passenger side.
With no nose cones cluttering up his home, Nathan's been free to indulge in collecting aspects of the Concorde dining experience, which he sees as the part of the plane's history that's most relatable.
That's the most accessible part and understandable part of the Concorde. You don't have to be an engineer to appreciate the mechanical design or the aerospace design or the mechanical systems in the plane. They were the parts that you could see and touch most readily if you were lucky enough to have a flight on the Concorde. And they were also sort of the most considered from a classic design standpoint. One of the things that draws me to the Concorde is that the exterior shape is a function of its performance. It's about aerodynamics, and yet it comes out to be an absolutely elegant, beautiful plane as well. So that it's not like design is absent, but the requirements and the goals of the design on the interior of the parts of the passenger experience are less constrained by sort of the mechanical, physical realities or needs of the plane.
And an easily acquirable representation of the attention to design that the Concorde represented.
That's a really important part too. And I have to say, an easily storable part too. I don't know where people put that nose cone or the parts of the fuselage or the wings, when they get them, because I don't have that kind of space.
With the space he's got, Nathan has opted to primarily collect items from the British Airways or BA side of the Concorde story versus Air France, which begs the question, why not emphasize both airlines equally? Why have you focused primarily on BA?
I think that part of it is just expediency. Like, you have to focus somewhere. You can't collect everything and everything. And I also didn't collect the previous fits of BA either, partly because they were much more traditional. And from a design standpoint, I don't think that they were as elegant or sort of evocative of the Concorde experience. But I do have a couple collections of like the brochures and the sort of passenger inserts in the back of the seats, et cetera, from previous fits. It was more a matter of focusing on the parts that spoke to me most. Interesting enough, that the original Air France silverware was created by Raymond Loewy, and they're very designy. And at the same time, they're very much of an era to me. It's not maybe the design aesthetic that speaks to me. And so I made a conscious decision that even though they were recognized as valuable and valuable design sort of solutions in history, I just wasn't going to go there. And so I have not focused on Air France at all, except when these few, I think it's only 3 or 4 pieces that I have from Air France. These few things have come up because they were so exquisitely considered and designed that they really spoke to me.
The unique nature of the place settings, from their size to their branding, makes these Concorde accoutrements such special collector's items?
I mean, these are very unusual items because, of course, even the dinner plate would probably be the size of a salad plate on, a normal, table in a dining room. You would find from anywhere from IKEA up to the most expensive, China manufacturers. So they're all small pieces. They're very light, even if they're ceramics or China. They're not everyday use appropriate. They're just kind of funky. Like if you invited someone over for dinner and served on this, people would look at you a little oddly, most likely, unless it was the theme of the dinner.
Are they labeled Concorde?
Let's see. Different parts are. Usually on the back, they have a little Concorde swoosh. It's a different swoosh than the Nike swoosh. There's a couple different logos. There is a little Concorde silhouette that's used on some items, mostly the passenger gift items. On the actual sort of place settings, mostly they use the British Airways swoosh, that sort of flag that turns back on itself. So they do have that, in which case what's interesting is that, here is servingware, placeware that is only used on the Concorde, but it has the BA swoosh, the BA logo. So technically it could be used in first class or business class on a BA flight, but it never was.
Nathan is quick to point out that BA consistently marketed the Concorde as its own unique and elevated travel experience.
British Airways was always careful to keep the Concorde in a class by itself, and it was never called first class, and it really didn't qualify as first class either, even though the service was impeccable and the food was good, etc., and the materials used, like in the seats, were high quality. Essentially, you were sitting in an economy class sized seat that just had nicer materials and appointments. So it was always this other vector of passenger experience. It was never applicable to first class anyway. So it was always kept Concorde. And there was always a Concorde lounge in New York and in London that was separate from the first class lounge or the other kind of classes of lounges that they had.
Consistent branding throughout.
Yeah, I think they tried to keep it really special. I got to talk to one of the designers of the materials for the last interior fit once, and he said the most succinct thing about Concorde, and that was that it was the oldest plane in British Airways' entire fleet when they finally retired it, and it was the only one that represented the future.
It's an interesting way of looking at it.
But I think that's why it was so special to them. And in fact, I have seen people in interviews say, especially people who lived around London, here are busy people with busy lives and often jaded, but when the Concorde flew overhead, everyone stopped and looked.
So people looked up with a mix of pride and noise pollution, maybe?
Well, literally and figuratively, yes.
Nathan has other slightly less obvious pieces from inside the Concorde, including an array of printed materials that passengers would have found tucked into the plane's seatbacks.
I have been known to take safety card information from certain planes. Actually, probably only two planes, the Concorde and the 787. Oh, and the 747. So my office area in my apartment is really just two first class seats from the 747 circa probably the late 80s. They're actually off a Continental 747. And I had them refinished because they were sort of this really not particularly attractive brown and orange fabric. So I had them remade by an automobile car seat reupholsterer. So they're all black. It's not real leather, but whatever, Naugahyde or whatever. And that's my office. So I'm sitting right now in the airline seats talking to you with the side table up with my laptop sitting on it. And this is where I get most of my work done. That's where I have most of my meetings when I'm at home. And it represents where I have always gotten my most focused work done, which is on the plane, because there are few distractions, one of which being the internet. Even though you can get Wi-Fi and internet access on the plane now, it's usually not very good and worth getting. So I have written most of my books and done lots of work on the plane. And so I sort of do the same thing at home in these airline seats, but they're not Concorde seats. They're much bigger.
Natural follow-up question. Do you have an oxygen mask dangling down from the ceiling?
Oh, that never occurred to me. Oh, that's a dangerous suggestion. You can buy those assemblies, by the way. Oh, no comment.
We'll have to do a part 2.
I'm afraid of that part 2 now. It's a great suggestion.
And then there was the time back in 2007 when Nathan hosted a Concorde-themed dinner party in his San Francisco home. He was just a few years into his collecting at that point, and it was a great excuse to get together with friends and trot out all those Concorde place settings and other collectibles.
It was wonderful. I may have gone a little overboard, but I had my own ticket from the Concorde, so I designed and printed up invitations using the template of a Concorde ticket, an airline ticket, plus the envelope, the sort of fold-over envelope that it came in, and that's how I sent the invites out. And then I sent a reminder via email using the template that they had sent me originally for the tickets and the reservation. And then when people got there, the place settings were set with the Concorde placeware. And then I had made little seat signs, like little stand-up seat signs. So everyone had their reservation where they were sitting. And then off in the sort of living room, I used to live in the loft, and off sort of in the living room area, I had set up all of the non-tableware stuff. So the brochures and the other memorabilia and the gift items, etc. And then I did sort of design a 5-course meal from elements all over the world. And the whole point of the meal, aside from just being able to use my Concorde ware, was to have a dinner of travel stories. So everyone was asked to bring and share like their most fun or most ridiculous or most horrendous travel stories. And so we told travel stories all evening.
But Nathan didn't want to be stuck in the galley, so to speak. He wanted to mingle with the passengers. So to help him participate, he assembled a 2-person flight crew to handle the meal service.
So I basically prepped everything and hired 2 of my students to be the servers, to be the flight attendants. One came wearing a white button-down shirt and pants, and I had a Concorde tie for him to wear. And the other had a Concorde scarf around her neck. And I left these really detailed instructions. It was sort of like almost like an IKEA instruction booklet for how to assemble the dinner and what pieces to assemble when, etc., so that I could be as much focused on the dinner as possible. And that turned out to be just the best decision, because otherwise I would have been, running back and forth and cooking and trying to assemble and all that kind of stuff. So it was just a lot of fun. And there are some great travel stories among your friends, let me tell you.
So let's talk about the gift items you've managed to collect over the years. Any standouts there?
There's some really interesting ones, but ultimately not super useful ones. Like there's a little, and again, I've focused on the BA stuff, not the Air France stuff. There's a little travel clock that swings out to have 2 different timepieces so that you could always have them set at 2 different time zones, which I thought was just sort of a really wonderful opportunity that wouldn't make sense for any other airline to do other than maybe Air France. That was just really appropriate. And it's nicely designed and everything, but it's not like I would use it day to day. The luggage tags are nice little moments. There's some nice little pieces, like there's a pair of binoculars and some photo frames and a business card holder, if people ever even do those things anymore. There's a ruler made out of the metal material that the leading edge of the plane and the vanes of the engines is made out of, because it has to withhold super high temperatures, as you can imagine. The other pieces, there's a tie bar, and then there's some cufflinks. And I think the cufflinks are probably my favorite item because they're very subtle. I don't wear a shirt that uses, I don't wear a lot of long sleeve shirts anyway, let alone one that would require a cufflink. But when I do, I have these little Concorde cufflinks, and someone might comment on them if I'm wearing them. And then that's an opportunity to maybe connect with someone on a level or tell a story. So I think those are my favorite pieces of the gift items because they are subtle. They don't draw a lot of attention, but when they do, they sort of draw the right kind of attention. And there's something I can use out there I don't walk around with a flask, but I have 2 different Concorde flasks. You don't pull the blankets out often. So the other ones just aren't as useful in my day-to-day life.
So are there any items out there you're still looking to acquire?
No, they're not. Except now, apparently, I need to get a oxygen mask. No, every now and then I'll find something that's intriguing to me. I have seen most of what's ever been available anyway. But in terms of other, I've collected servingware. I have an ice bucket and a tray and a creamer. And, it's nice to have them. It sort of completes the collection. But again, it's not something that necessarily enhances my life. If there were a piece that I saw that would enhance my life in some way or complete the collection in some way, I would definitely consider getting it. But for the most part, I sort of feel like the collection for now is complete.
And sizable.
Kinda, yeah.
Of course, Nathan's ultimate Concorde keepsake may be the memory of flying on the plane, which he managed to make happen just prior to the aircraft's retirement in 2003.
Yeah, it was very interesting. First of all, I'm incredibly privileged to even have had the opportunity, not just monetarily, but timing-wise, right? Like a year later, it could never have happened. And I remember when they stopped service on the Concorde after the accident, thinking, oh God, like that was my only chance. The chances of me going to the ISS or going up in space are not huge, but this one was kind of obtainable. And so when they stopped service, I honestly didn't expect them to restart service because it's such an expensive plane, because it was such an old plane. And so when they did, I kind of made it a priority to figure out a way to get on it. And when I did at the beginning of the summer, they had just reopened tickets. And it was a really interesting moment because for whatever reason, they were offering really good prices. I think because they were concerned that maybe people didn't feel comfortable flying on it. So it wasn't nearly as expensive as it had been in the past. It was still an expensive trip, but it was much more attainable for me. I didn't document every little last piece of it. There's probably things I wish I would have. I never went to the bathroom on the Concorde, which was kind of dumb in retrospect, but I was sitting in the window. I didn't want to bother the guy next to me. So the experience of being on the Concorde, it's a little cramped. It's small. It's much more similar to like a CRJ regional jet than even a 737. And it's cut up into 2 cabins. So I was in the front cabin, but it just doesn't give you a sense of the size of the plane once you're in it, because you really do feel how small the cross section is. Everything was beautiful. The service was impeccable, but it also happens really quickly. In some ways, it almost happens faster than you can really take it all in. By the time they start service with a glass of champagne and a little hors d'oeuvre and then the different courses and then the aperitif, like at the end of dinner, they're packing everything up because we're landing in a moment. So the timing is just a little disorienting because you're used to a much longer flight and a much longer experience. I don't remember the big kick that everyone talks about when it takes off and they put the afterburners on. To me, it didn't seem like something more powerful or faster as a takeoff than you would in a modern other jet anyway. But landing was definitely different. Once you pass land, very quickly, I remember a deep bank, and then we leveled off again, and then another deep bank. And then we were landing. So the whole landing happened much faster than you would on a normal passenger plane.
Uh-huh. And I'm a little disappointed you didn't use the restroom.
I am too. It never even occurred to me. Like it all happened so quickly. And I didn't want to bother the guy next to me who did not have the meal because he was working on something, I assume, much more important. I mean, I was literally a tourist on this flight and I just didn't want to bother the people that, were important people that, were doing work.
Uh-huh. So one last question for you. The Concorde epitomized one-of-a-kind achievement in design, inside and out. So what lessons can designers or others who have an interest in or an eye for design take away from the legacy of the Concorde?
Ooh, that's a really great question. The Concorde is one of those things that's in a very small class of objects or things that have been designed by any humans that does have this symbolic representation of things much greater than, what its utilitarian function were. In this case, wonder being one of them, or accomplishment, beauty for sure. From the outside, like I said, it's a beautiful plane if you ever get the chance to see one in person. And it's such a plane hitting above its weight in terms of cultural impact. I'm sure also in terms of, noise impact for those folks that live near those airports. But I don't know if you can take a lot away from the exterior of the plane just because it is so functionally mediated and really devoid of ornamentation in the design sense, and yet still comes out being this interesting form. So I think the lesson from the exterior is one of maybe biomimicry, letting the form follow its function in nature, in physics, in engineering, etc. On the interior, though, I think that there maybe are some other lessons. That first interior is not particularly pleasant, certainly not by today's standards, but certainly by the time the Concorde got later and then at the end, BA specifically understood this plane's place in history and in culture, and they rose to that occasion. That last fit is obviously carefully designed with the uniqueness of the plane. So the curve of the champagne glass, if you look at the knife in the place setting, it sort of curves, and some of the gift items, specifically the Air France gift items, they pull a theme from the plane itself and its uniqueness, and then really carefully sort of elevate it in a beautiful way. And I think that should have been always the case. And I think that's what designers can take away, is making things special and unique, but in a really authentic way. The design of those pieces really came out of the authentic and unique parts of the plane itself and the experience itself. And so I really appreciate that.
Sure. Sounds like a lot of people still do.
Yeah, I think so.
Well, Nathan, I think it's time to put our seats in the upright position and prepare for landing here, which is my not so elegant way of saying that we're out of time. So I want to thank you so much for talking about your very thorough efforts to track down all things Concorde. And what can I say? I appreciate you letting me into this exclusive world for a bit.
That's the perfect ending. But I will say, if you want to come see the collection in person, just, I'll pull some of it out and we can have tea, and maybe crumpets would be appropriate on the Concorde ware.
Yes, I want to feel like a champagne sipping rock star for a little while.
Excellent. Thank you.
Okay. Bye-bye.
Goodbye.
Well, even though it's been 2 decades since the Concorde's final flight, Nathan Shedroff's love of the glamorous supersonic marvel doesn't seem to have lost any momentum. The Concorde itself may be aviation history at this point, but Nathan's got a house full of place settings, servingware, sleeping masks, and other paraphernalia that he can always use to quickly bring it back to life a bit. Maybe even faster than the speed of sound. ×2. For Keeps is a production of me, David Peterkovsky. My thanks to Nathan Shedroff for talking about his passion for the legendary, late-great Concorde aircraft. At forkeepspodcast.com, you'll see photos of Nathan and some of the items from his impressive collection. You'll also find a link to his website, where he's got more photos of his collection and of his Concorde-themed dinner party. The show's theme song is by Still Flyin, and the closing theme is by Eric Frisch. Additional music for this episode was provided by the Lounge Bar Orchestra and Chad Crouch. Thanks for listening to For Keeps. Until next time, keep on keeping on.